Autistic adults face systemic physical outcomes, severe mortality gaps, elevated suicide risk, and the physiological collapse of burnout. These realities resist traditional diagnostic categories. The medical model locates the source of this dysfunction entirely within individual neurology, treating the biology of the person as the primary site of defect. While the social model correctly identifies environmental barriers, it can overlook the physical reality of sensory pain and the energetic exhaustion that accompanies neurological difference. Hybrid approaches like the biopsychosocial model attempt to bridge this gap by listing biological and social factors. However, they lack a mechanistic currency to explain how these separate domains interact to shape a person's health over time. Understanding the physiological breakdown of neurodivergent populations requires a move past both the intrinsic defect model and the purely sociological model. We need a framework that explains the biological cost of environmental mismatch. The Evolutionary-Stress Framework, or ESF, provides a complexity-based alternative that treats the organism and the environment as a single interacting system. Contemporary neuroscience views the brain and body as a unified metabolic energy regulating system. The brain actively allocates metabolic resources to maintain stability, anticipating the body's needs before they arise. This process is known as allostasis, the capacity to achieve stability through constant predictive adjustments to changing environmental conditions. Within this framework, pathology functions as a system state called stress incoherence. This occurs when an organism's energy management strategy meets an incompatible environment, making its long-standing calibrations unsustainable. This circuit illustrates predictive processing. The brain minimizes metabolic costs by constantly generating predictions about incoming sensory and interoceptive signals. When incoming data fails to match a prediction, the resulting prediction error forces the brain to expend metabolic energy to update its internal models. Stress describes the literal energetic and informational work required to maintain coherence when environmental demands exceed the system's predictive capacity. To conserve energy, the brain is highly motivated to seek out environments where its predictions consistently succeed. Stress and energy regulation act as the translation mechanism, the biological currency that turns environmental friction into physical allostatic load. This process begins with developmental calibration. As shown in this chart, nervous systems tune their sensitivity profiles to the specific predictability and safety of their early environments. This tuning stabilizes into an emergent neurotype, a characteristic configuration of energy allocation, prediction strategy, and stress responsivity. Specific autistic traits emerge as efficient energy allocation strategies. Monotropism, for instance, prioritizes deep learning in a limited number of channels to manage metabolic constraints. Similarly, enhanced perceptual functioning represents a calibrated prediction regime that weights its resources toward high-precision, fine-grained environmental sampling. These diverse profiles represent the system's best adaptive recalibration to the specific ecology it inhabited during development. Some clinical models attempt a compromise, affirming acceptable neurodivergent strengths while medically correcting disordered deficits. The center panel illustrates why this split is biologically impossible. The exact same underlying regulatory architecture produces both the capability and the vulnerability. A high-precision sensory architecture provides elite pattern detection in a predictable environment, yet produces overwhelming sensory pain in a chaotic one. Removing a vulnerability through behavioral suppression inherently alters the corresponding strength, because they both emerge from the same calibration. Dysfunction measures the fit between a person's regulatory architecture and their current environmental context. The etymology of the word normal traces back to the Latin norma, a carpenter's square used to impose right angles. It was a tool for construction, not a description of human nature. In the 19th century, Adolphe Quetelet introduced the average man, fatally transforming statistical means into developmental ideals that bodies were expected to meet. This created the one environment problem. Industrial modernity standardized the world, building physical institutions like this classroom around a mythical middle. Industrial systems scaled this norm globally, enforcing one light cycle, one sensory load, and one rigid cadence of productivity upon all bodies. By constructing an artificially narrow ecology, Industrial systems manufactured a population of failures whose distress said everything about the environment and nothing about the bodies themselves. Forcing an architectural minority into a standardized environment creates a persistent state of high prediction error. Stress incoherence represents the tipping point where these internal calibrations become metabolically unsustainable, leading to cascading dysregulation across the body. The framework reframes multimorbidities, the clustering of gastrointestinal, immune, and psychiatric conditions in autistic adults, as co-calibration. These conditions cluster because the same allostatic architecture regulates the gut, the immune system, and sensory processing. Under chronic strain, they break down collectively. Autistic burnout and reduced life expectancy represent the physical manifestation of allostatic load embedding across physiological systems over time. This mismatch is sustained by empathy as projection, where observers use their own nervous system as the template to judge another person's distress. Relying on self-reference leads neurotypical observers to mistake nervous system overload or sensory pain for willful defiance or manipulation. This misreading becomes the official clinical record, initiating a cycle of behavioral correction that ignores the underlying regulatory crisis. The organism is then forced to absorb the metabolic penalty of masking, draining the energy required for basic biological regulation. True empathy requires an embodied ecology, identifying what environmental inputs a specific body is being forced to bear. Standard inclusion frameworks focus on accommodation, which still positions the individual as the problem requiring an exception to the rule. The goal of the Evolutionary-Stress Framework is co-regulation, shifting the regulatory labor off the individual and distributing it into the design of the environment. Co-regulation involves establishing temporal predictability, aligning sensory loads, and respecting chronodiversity, the natural variations in how different bodies keep time. These interventions must be personalized. A sensory input that stabilizes one system may completely deplete another. Support aims to reduce energetic mismatch and restore the system's regulatory coherence, rather than training compliance to a norm. Evolutionary fitness concerns the success of an organism relative to its environment. It describes the match between architecture and ecology, rather than a rank of strength or normalcy. Fitness is a relationship, the specific match between a body's regulatory architecture and the demands of its environment. Architectural diversity is a population-scale necessity, preventing a whole group from failing uniformly under the same environmental conditions. In this light, health is emergent allostasis, the sustained ability to adapt and maintain coherence across the lifespan. Ensuring human viability requires building a world varied enough to sustain our biological architectures, rather than mistaking industrial standardization for human nature.